The air inside Pearson Adler's law firm was thick with wealth and arrogance. Richard Hale strode through the polished marble floors, his tailored suit crisp, his every step radiating power. The receptionist barely had time to greet him before he waved her off, heading straight to the conference room. He had no patience for formalities. This was just a routine process, a formality before he claimed what was rightfully his. At 53 years old, Richard was at the peak of his empire. As the CEO of Hale Enterprises, he had dominated the corporate world, turning failing businesses into gold. His influence stretched across real estate, finance, and technology, with his name commanding respect in every boardroom. And now, with the passing of his longtime business partner, George Pearson, he was about to solidify his legacy. Pearson had been a kingmaker in the business world, a man whose connections opened doors Richard could have never reached alone. They had been close, at least that's what Richard believed. He had no doubt that Pearson's will contained exactly what he expected: a massive inheritance, a controlling stake in their joint ventures, and another step toward untouchable wealth. Settling into the leather chair at the long mahogany table, Richard smirked as the room filled with other beneficiaries, lesser figures in Pearson's empire. Family members, distant business associates, all of them were waiting, hoping for a fraction of Pearson's fortune. But Richard, he wasn't hoping. He was expecting. The lawyer Thomas Adler cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses. The room fell silent. "We are gathered today to read the last will and testament of Mr. George Pearson," Adler began, his voice steady and professional. Richard barely listened to the smaller allocations. Properties to nieces, trust funds to charity, stock distributions to longtime employees. None of it mattered. He leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers against the table, waiting for his name to be called. And then he saw it. Amara Johnson. Richard's eyebrows lifted, confusion flashing across his face. His ex-wife? The name sat there on the page, bold and undeniable. She had been included in Pearson's will. A beat of silence. Then Richard let out a short, sharp laugh. "Amara Johnson?" he scoffed, shaking his head as if he had misheard. "What, did Pearson leave her a small donation for charity or something?" His voice dripped with amusement. Several eyes turned toward him, but Richard didn't care. This had to be a joke. The lawyer didn't smile. He didn't even blink. Instead, he calmly turned the page and spoke words that changed everything. "To Amara Johnson, I leave the controlling majority of Hale Enterprises, along with all associated assets and executive authority over its future direction." The room went silent. Richard's smirk vanished. For the first time in his life, he couldn't move. He couldn't think. It was as if the ground beneath him had been ripped away. The air in the room turned suffocating. He stared at the lawyer, waiting for him to correct himself, waiting for someone to say this was a mistake. Nothing came. Adler continued reading, his voice even, his words clear. There was no mistake. George Pearson had handed everything, Richard's empire, his legacy, his life's work, to Amara, the ex-wife he had used, betrayed, abandoned. Richard's hands clenched into fists. A slow, creeping horror crawled up his spine. This wasn't just an inheritance. This was revenge. Richard Hale wasn't just powerful, he was ruthless. From the moment he stepped into the corporate world, he had one rule: dominate or be dominated. He built Hale Enterprises with an iron fist, expanding aggressively into real estate, finance, and technology. Competitors feared him. Employees obeyed him. Investors worshipped him. But beneath the polished exterior, Richard had mastered the art of deception. To the world, he was a progressive leader, a man who embraced diversity and inclusion. His speeches at business summits preached equal opportunities and corporate responsibility. He sponsored scholarships for underprivileged students, attended charity galas, and posed for photos shaking hands with Black executives. But behind closed doors, it was all an illusion. Richard controlled everything: who rose, who stayed behind, and who was kept powerless. His Black executives, handpicked for optics, placed in positions where they had no real influence, Business deals with black-owned firms, token partnerships designed for PR stunts never meant to last. He didn't need to be openly racist. He was smarter than that. He played the system, ensuring that real power never left his hands. And then came Amara Johnson, the one woman who almost changed everything. Richard met Amara at a high-profile networking event 10 years ago. She was brilliant, a self-made black businesswoman who had built her investment consultancy firm from the ground up. She was respected in circles that Richard had struggled to break into, a powerful figure among black investors, political leaders, and high-net-worth entrepreneurs. And that's when Richard saw an opportunity. If he married Amara, he wouldn't just improve his public image, he would gain access to her world. So he charmed her, played the role of the devoted partner, showered her with extravagant gifts, sweet words, and carefully calculated moments of affection. Amara was cautious at first, but Richard was a master manipulator. He made her believe in the fairy tale, sold her the dream of a power couple, building an empire together. And within a year, she said yes. For a while, the arrangement was perfect. With Amara by his side, Richard was welcomed into elite spaces that had once been close to him. Investors who valued social consciousness and diversity now trusted him. Deals came easier. His business empire expanded faster than ever. But as soon as Richard got what he wanted, he no longer needed her. The divorce was brutal. Amara never saw it coming. One day, Richard was her loving husband, discussing plans for their future. The next, she was served with divorce papers, blindsided by his cold efficiency. Richard had already made sure she left with nothing. His lawyers, armed with ironclad prenuptial agreements and legal loopholes, tore through every financial connection she had. By the time the papers were signed, Amara had lost everything she had built alongside him. She was erased from his life. And Richard? He moved on without a second thought. To him, Amara was a transaction that had expired, a tool he had used and discarded. He never expected to see her again. He never imagined she would one day own him. But now, sitting in that law office, staring at her name in Pearson's will, Richard felt something he hadn't felt in decades. Fear. Amara was back. And this time, she had all the power. The weight of the words hung in the air like a death sentence. To Amara Johnson, I leave the controlling majority of Hale Enterprises, along with all associated assets and executive authority over its future direction. Richard froze. His mind refused to process what he had just heard. The sound of his own heartbeat pounded in his ears. He could feel every pair of eyes in the room on him, watching, waiting for his reaction. "What the hell are you talking about?" Richard's voice sliced through the silence, sharp with disbelief. The lawyer, Thomas Adler, remained composed. He adjusted his glasses and turned the page of the will, continuing as if Richard's outburst was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. "Mr. Pearson amended his will 3 months before his passing," Adler stated. "After careful consideration, he decided that the future of Hale Enterprises would be best placed in the hands of Amara Johnson." Richard slammed his fist against the table. "That's impossible. Pearson barely even knew Amara. He would never leave her my company." The room tensed. A few attendees exchanged uneasy glances. No one dared to speak. Adler, unfazed, let out a slow breath before meeting Richard's furious gaze. "On the contrary, Mr. Hale, Pearson knew exactly who Amara Johnson was. In fact, he knew far more than you realized." Richard's stomach twisted. "What are you talking about?" His voice was quieter now, but still seething. Adler took his time flipping through the documents before looking Richard straight in the eye. "George Pearson knew the truth about you. All of it." Silence. "He knew about the lies, the manipulation, the fake progressive image you created for the media. He knew how you treated your employees behind closed doors, especially the ones who didn't look like you." Richard felt a cold chill spread through his chest. "He knew what you did to Amara. It was like being punched in the gut." Richard's face darkened. He glanced toward Amara, who sat calmly across the table, her expression unreadable. She had known this was coming. She had sat there waiting for him to realize it. "Pearson wouldn't do this," Richard hissed. His mind raced, trying to rationalize, trying to control the situation. He was my mentor, my partner. This company was built on our deals, our strategy. Why the hell would he hand it over to? He cut himself off just in time. To her. To a black woman he had discarded and underestimated. Adler raised an eyebrow, almost as if he knew exactly what Richard had been about to say. Because Pearson finally saw you for what you are, he replied, his voice sharp. And he realized Amara Johnson was everything you pretended to be. The room was dead silent. Richard's hands tightened into fists. This couldn't be happening. This had to be a mistake. This will can't be legal, he snapped. Pearson was an old man. He was probably sick when he made these changes. There's no way this holds up in court. Adler's lips pressed into a thin line. The will is airtight, Mr. Hale. It was revised under full legal supervision. Every decision was documented, reviewed, and finalized. Pearson was of sound mind. The board has already been informed. The transition of power is effective immediately. Richard's vision blurred with rage. Effective immediately. It was real. The empire he had built. The company he had sacrificed everything for. The legacy he had spent his entire life controlling. Gone. And the woman he had destroyed now owned him. He turned to Amara. She had barely spoken a word since the reading began. She had let the will speak for itself. Now, finally, she met his gaze. Her expression was calm, too calm. There was no gloating, no mocking smirk, just satisfaction. She had waited for this moment. Richard gritted his teeth. His blood burned with humiliation, but he wasn't done yet. I'll fight this, he growled, his voice low and venomous. You think you've won, but I'll find a way to take it back. For the first time, Amara smiled, a slow, knowing smile. You've already lost, Richard. Richard stormed out of the law office, his mind a whirlwind of rage and disbelief. This wasn't over. It couldn't be over. His limousine was already waiting, the driver opening the door for him with his usual robotic efficiency. But this time, Richard didn't acknowledge him. He slid into the back seat, his pulse hammering. Oh, Hale Enterprises, now, he snapped. The driver obeyed, the car pulling smoothly onto the street. But Richard barely noticed the city passing by. His jaw clenched so tightly it ached. The will was a setup. It had to be. Pearson had been manipulated, coerced, or worse, he had gone senile before his death. There had to be a loophole, a technicality, something he could use to rip Hale Enterprises back from Amara's hands. The arrogant, self-satisfied look on her face as he left the room replayed in his head. You've already lost, Richard. His fingernails dug into his palms. No, he hadn't lost. Not yet. By the time Richard marched through the front doors of Hale Enterprises, he was boiling. The moment he stepped inside, he felt it. The shift. It was subtle, but it was there. The way the receptionist hesitated before greeting him. The way passing employees stole glances, their conversations lowering into whispers as soon as they saw him. Some faces held thinly veiled amusement, others pity. They knew. Of course they knew. News this big didn't stay contained. The board had already been informed, which meant the entire company was talking about it. Richard Hale, the once untouchable titan of this empire, had just been dethroned. He clenched his fists and strode forward, his pace aggressive, his footsteps echoing off the polished marble floors. He needed to take back control. He needed to find his people, the executives he had placed in power, the board members who owed him everything. He needed to remind them who really ran this company. But before he could take another step, his phone buzzed. He pulled it out, his hands gripping the device with white-knuckled force. A new email had just come in. His breath caught as his own company's logo appeared at the top of the screen. Subject, leadership update, effective immediately. His stomach twisted as he read the words beneath it. Effective immediately, Amara Johnson has assumed full leadership as CEO of Hale Enterprises. A cold chill spread through his body. His entire world tilted as his eyes scanned the next few lines. Richard Hale will remain with the company in an advisory capacity. His new role will be determined after further evaluation. The words blurred as his vision swam with pure, unchecked fury. Advisory capacity? Advisory capacity! That wasn't a position. That was a death sentence. It was corporate exile, a way to strip him of real power while pretending he still had a place. This had to be a mistake. It had to be a temporary measure. He shoved the phone back into his pocket and stormed toward the elevators, his pulse hammering against his skull. When Richard reached the executive floor, reality hit him like a freight train. His nameplate was gone from the CEO's office. The massive, glass-paneled door, his door, was now firmly shut, Amara's name replacing his. But that wasn't the worst part. As he turned the corner, he came face to face with the new power structure of Hale Enterprises. Executives, his former subordinates, stood in small groups, talking in hushed tones. Some of them glanced at him with forced politeness, others with undisguised amusement. But what made his blood boil was who was leading those conversations. The very people he had spent years sidelining. The black executives he had once considered nothing more than PR tokens. The employees he had strategically placed in positions with no real authority. Now, they outranked him. They were making decisions he had no power over. And Amara, his ex-wife, the woman he had tossed aside like a broken tool, was now his superior. For the first time in his life, Richard felt small. This wasn't just losing power. This was humiliation. And the worst part? There wasn't a damn thing he could do about it. Richard wasn't done yet. They thought they could strip him of power, sideline him, and expect him to sit quietly like a defeated man? No. He had built Hale Enterprises. It was his company. And if Amara thought she could take it from him, she was dead wrong. Richard knew he couldn't attack Amara directly. Not yet. She had Pearson's backing, an airtight legal claim, and public support behind her. The board was watching her every move, and the stock price was actually rising under her leadership. But Richard had spent his life playing corporate warfare. He knew how to manipulate the system, how to plant doubts, how to pull the right strings. So he started making calls. Late at night, behind closed doors. One by one, he reached out to his old allies, executives, board members, investors, people who had benefited under his rule. Amara doesn't belong here, he told them in hushed, urgent tones. She doesn't understand how this business works. She's making reckless decisions that will destroy us. Most were hesitant. They had seen Amara's competence. They had seen the media hail her as a symbol of justice, a woman reclaiming what was stolen from her. But Richard knew how to play on fear. It's only a matter of time before her leadership ruins us. But if we act now, we can still take back control. He planted seeds of doubt. Now he just needed proof to turn those doubts into panic. Richard needed a scandal, something big enough to shake investor confidence. So he created one. Using his last loyal connections in the finance department, he forged internal documents, altered financial reports that made it look like Amara was mismanaging company funds. Then he found the perfect pawn, a nervous, mid-level analyst named Elliot Graves. Elliot was ambitious, desperate to prove himself, and, most importantly, easily manipulated. "We need a compliance review," Richard told him, sliding a folder of falsified financial inconsistencies across the desk. "Just go through these records, raise some red flags internally. If anything looks suspicious, report it." Elliot hesitated. "But Miss Johnson is running things now. If I—" "Exactly," Richard interrupted. "And if she's making mistakes, it needs to be caught early, right?" A few days later, the fake financial discrepancies were discovered and leaked to select board members. Then, Richard paid a journalist to run an anonymous tip. By the next morning, a headline had begun circulating online. "Trouble at Hale Enterprises? Sources say new CEO faces internal financial scrutiny." Richard sat in his office, smirking at the headline. It had begun. The whispers started almost immediately. Board members grew uneasy. Investors started asking questions. Richard could feel the power shifting back in his favor. Until the emergency board meeting was called. He walked into the conference room with calculated confidence, expecting to see panic on Amara's face. Instead, she sat at the head of the table, calm, unshaken. And in front of her, a folder. A folder with his forged financial documents. Richard's pulse skipped. She knew. "Before we begin," Amara said smoothly, tapping the folder, "I'd like to address the reports that surfaced this morning." She glanced around the room, her voice cool, measured, but sharp as a blade. An internal audit was conducted. And guess what? The so-called discrepancies, they don't exist. Murmurs spread through that boardroom. "Not only that," Amara continued, flipping through pages, "but we traced the source of these errors, and it led us to one person." She slid a document across the table. A security report. It showed who had accessed the financial records. And the name at the top of the list? Richard Hale. The boardroom fell dead silent. Richard's breath caught in his throat. Amara leaned back, watching him with a predatory kind of patience. "Do you have anything to say, Richard?" she asked. A long, unbearable pause. Richard opened his mouth to deny, to spin, to say something. But before he could, a voice interrupted. "Sir?" Two security guards stood at the door. "Effective immediately, the board has decided to terminate your employment with Hale Enterprises." Richard felt his entire world collapse. "You can't do this," he growled. "I built this company." "And now you've lost it," Amara cut in, her voice final. He barely felt the guards grab his arms. His ears rang as they marched him through the same hallways where he had once ruled as a king. Employees stared, some with shock, some with smirks. He had humiliated others in these very halls. Now it was his turn. The elevator doors slid shut, and with them, the last remnants of Richard Hale's power. The news broke like a wildfire, spreading across every major business outlet. Richard Hale exposed for corporate fraud. Fallen Titan, how one man's greed led to his own ruin. Hale Enterprises betrayed from within, by its own founder. Richard sat frozen in his penthouse, staring at the glowing headlines on his massive TV screen. His own face, once plastered on business magazines as a visionary leader, was now the face of corporate corruption. Every article detailed his desperate attempt to frame Amara, his forged documents, and his failed coup. News anchors tore him apart, analysts mocked him, and former business allies distanced themselves from him like he was infected with the plague. His phone wouldn't stop buzzing, riding calls from lawyers, board members, journalists, and investors, each one a fresh nail in his coffin. But none of them mattered, because the worst call had already come. His bank accounts were frozen. His assets were under investigation. And the legal cases were piling up. The stock market was ruthless. The moment Richard's fraud was exposed, Hale Enterprises shares plummeted, but only for a moment. Then something unexpected happened. Amara took control of the damage. She held an emergency press conference, standing tall in front of flashing cameras, her voice steady and commanding. "We will not let the past define our future," she declared. Investors, expecting chaos, instead saw stability. The stock rebounded, and then, to Richard's horror, it climbed even higher than before. Under Amara's leadership, Hale Enterprises was thriving. She renegotiated deals Richard had fumbled. She secured new, powerful investors who had once avoided the company. She rebranded Hale Enterprises as an ethical, inclusive corporation. And it worked. The media loved her. The investors trusted her. And Richard? He was rotting in obscurity. There was only one thing left Richard still had: his name. The Hale name meant something in the business world. It carried weight, history, recognition. It was the last piece of power he had left. Until Amara took that from him too. One morning, Richard woke up to a press conference playing on TV. Amara stood at a podium, smiling calmly at the cameras. Behind her, a massive screen displayed a new corporate logo. And with 4 simple words, she erased him from history. "Hey, Sue, We are rebranding. The screen shifted, revealing the new company name. Hale Enterprises was no more. Instead, it was now Pearson Johnson Global Holdings. Richard felt something snap inside him. He sat there in his now half-empty penthouse, gripping his glass so tightly his knuckles turned white. She had taken everything. His company, his money, his power, and now, his name. He was nothing now. The business world moved on without Richard Hale, nears Pearson Johnson. Global Holdings continued to flourish under Amar's leadership. She was now a respected icon in corporate America. Meanwhile, Richard was blacklisted. No company wanted to hire him. No investor wanted to be associated with him. No one returned his calls. The empire he had built over decades had been destroyed in months. Not by a rival, not by a competitor, but by the woman he had once used and discarded. And the worst part? She didn't ruin him. He did it to himself. The city stretched out before him, glittering against the night sky. Towering skyscrapers, glowing billboards, streets alive with movement. A world that had once belonged to him. Now it felt like a distant memory. Richard Hale sat in the darkness of his half-empty penthouse, a glass of whiskey in his hand. The expensive bottle sat next to him, barely touched. He had poured drink after drink, but somehow none of them made him feel numb enough. He had spent decades building an empire, carving out his name in the business world, making sure he was untouchable. Now he was forgotten. No one called him anymore. No meetings, no deals, no invitations to exclusive events. The stock market had moved on. The investors who once clung to his every word had abandoned him without a second thought. The powerful Richard Hale was just another cautionary tale now. He reached for the remote and turned on the massive flat-screen TV. The press conference was already in progress. Amara stood at the podium, wearing a sleek navy blue suit, exuding the same quiet confidence that had made her so dangerous to him. The banners behind her bore the new company name, Pearson Johnson Global Holdings. His name was gone, erased, like he had never existed. Today we close the chapter on the path. Amara was saying, her voice steady, unwavering. This company will stand for ethical leadership, for inclusion, for true progress. We will not be defined by those who sought to use and manipulate others. We will be defined by our commitment to something greater. The audience erupted in applause. Richard stared at the screen, his grip tightening around his glass. It was over. The empire was hers now. She had waited. She had planned. And when the moment came, she had taken everything. And the worst part? She never even had to get her hands dirty. He had done it to himself. He had been so obsessed with control, so desperate to keep his power that he had dug his own grave. The press conference continued, but Richard didn't hear the rest. His gaze drifted back to the city outside his window. The world kept moving without him. For the first time in his life, he felt small, insignificant, powerless. And as he sat there alone in the penthouse that now felt more like a prison, Richard finally understood. This wasn't just revenge. It was karma, and he had never stood a chance.